Now let us examine two of the most sophisticated ideas in Shakespearean histories: language as a tool of power and Shakespeare's manipulation of historical time. First, let us consider language as power. In Shakespeare's history plays, political authority is often connected to the ability to speak effectively. Language is not merely a method of communication, it is a weapon, a leadership tool, and a means of controlling public opinion. Strong rulers usually possess controlled, persuasive, and purposeful speech. They know how to inspire followers, negotiate with enemies, and project authority through words. Weak rulers, on the other hand, may speak beautifully but fail to influence political reality. A clear contrast can be seen between Richard II and Henry V. Richard II speaks in highly poetic, emotional, and symbolic language. His speeches are beautiful and philosophical, but they rarely solve political problems. His words express feelings rather than effective leadership. Henry V, in contrast, speaks directly, confidently, and persuasively. Whether addressing nobles, diplomats, or soldiers, his language motivates action and strengthens authority. His speeches help him unite the nation and inspire loyalty. Thus, Shakespeare suggests that successful kingship depends not only on legitimacy but also on rhetorical skill. Now let us turn to Shakespeare's manipulation of time. Historically, the events covered in the history plays occurred over many years, sometimes even decades. However, Shakespeare compresses long periods of history into a few hours of dramatic action. Events that happened years apart are often presented as if they occur in quick succession. This creates dramatic urgency and keeps the audience emotionally engaged. More importantly, this compression gives history a sense of inevitability. Political events appear to move toward a predetermined outcome, almost as if destiny is guiding the nation. As a result, the audience experiences history not as a collection of separate events but as a meaningful political narrative. This leads to an important examination line: time is shaped to create political meaning. In other words, Shakespeare does not simply record history. He reorganizes historical time in order to emphasize themes such as legitimacy, kingship, national destiny, and the restoration of political order. Therefore, both language and time become powerful artistic tools through which Shakespeare transforms historical events into compelling political drama. Now let us explore some of the most advanced ideas in Shakespearean histories, ideas that are often overlooked but are highly valuable for examinations and critical analysis. First, let us consider the theme of blood, lineage, and succession anxiety. Throughout the history plays, Shakespeare repeatedly focuses on royal bloodlines, inheritance, succession, and rightful heirs. Characters constantly debate who has the legitimate claim to the throne and whether political authority comes from birth, strength, or public support. Why is this theme so important? One reason is Shakespeare's historical context. During the reign of Elizabeth I, there was widespread anxiety about succession because Elizabeth had no direct heir. People worried about what would happen after her death and whether England might again experience political instability. As a result, Shakespeare's obsession with succession reflects real fears that existed in Elizabethan society. Questions about lineage are therefore not merely historical, they are deeply connected to contemporary political concerns. Next, let us turn to Falstaff, one of Shakespeare's most complex creations. At first glance, Falstaff appears to be simply a comic character who provides entertainment and humor. However, he is much more than comic relief. Falstaff represents realism in contrast to heroic idealism. He questions warfare, mocks conventional honor, and exposes the gap between political rhetoric and everyday reality. In many ways, he becomes the voice of common sense against political myths. His rejection by Prince Hal at the end of the Henry IV sequence is one of the most significant moments in Shakespearean histories. When Hal becomes King Henry V, he abandons Falstaff despite their long friendship. This moment symbolizes political necessity overcoming personal emotion. The critical insight here is that successful statecraft often requires the sacrifice of personal relationships. A ruler may have to place public duty above private affection. Finally, let us examine Shakespeare's treatment of war. Officially, war is often presented as heroic, patriotic, and glorious. Leaders speak of honor, courage, and national pride. However, Shakespeare frequently provides a hidden perspective. Behind the speeches and celebrations, war can also appear brutal, destructive, and even meaningless. Ordinary soldiers suffer, families are separated, and political ambitions often cause human tragedy. This dual perspective is especially visible in Henry V. On one hand, Henry inspires his soldiers through magnificent speeches and creates national unity. On the other hand, some critics argue that he also manipulates public emotion to achieve political goals. This creates an important dual interpretation. Henry V can be viewed either as a heroic national leader or as a skilled political strategist using rhetoric to gain support. Because Shakespeare presents both possibilities, the play remains one of the most debated works in English literature. Therefore, these themes of succession anxiety, Falstaff's realism, and the dual nature of war reveal the extraordinary depth and complexity of Shakespearean histories. Now let us explore three of the most advanced critical ideas in Shakespearean histories: the politics of fear, cyclical history, and the significance of what history leaves out. First, let us consider the politics of fear. Shakespeare shows that kings do not maintain power only through legitimacy or popularity. They also maintain authority through fear, surveillance, punishment, and control. Many rulers constantly worry about rebellion and political threats. As a result, they become suspicious, cautious, and obsessed with security. A good example is Henry IV. Although he successfully gains the throne, he never enjoys complete peace of mind. He constantly fears rebellion from nobles and challenges to his authority. Shakespeare suggests that political power often creates anxiety rather than stability. This reveals an important truth about politics. Rulers are not only powerful, they are also vulnerable and fearful. Now let us turn to the idea of cyclical history. One of the most sophisticated interpretations of Shakespearean histories is that history repeats itself. A king falls, another ruler rises, but many of the same political problems continue. Rebellion, legitimacy, succession disputes, and struggles for power appear again and again. For example, the fall of Richard II leads to the rise of Henry IV. However, instead of creating complete stability, new forms of political unrest emerge. This pattern continues throughout the history cycle. The critical idea here is that there may be no permanent political solution. Human ambition, conflict, and competition repeatedly generate new crises. Thus, Shakespeare's vision of history is not completely progressive. History often moves in circles rather than in a straight line toward perfection. Finally, let us examine silences and absences. Modern critics often ask an important question: what is missing from Shakespeare's version of history? In many history plays, the suffering of ordinary people receives relatively little attention compared to the actions of kings, nobles, and political leaders. Similarly, women frequently play important symbolic roles, but they are often excluded from direct political decision-making. These absences are significant because they remind us that history is selective storytelling. Every historical narrative chooses what to emphasize and what to leave out. Therefore, Shakespeare's histories do not simply present the past. They construct a particular version of the past, focusing on power, monarchy, and political conflict while leaving other voices less visible. This modern perspective encourages us to read Shakespeare critically and to ask not only what history tells us, but also what history chooses not to tell us. Now let us examine three highly advanced literary concepts in Shakespearean histories: mirror symbolism, body politic imagery, and the dramatic use of silence. First, let us look at mirror symbolism. One of the most memorable uses of a mirror appears in Richard II during the famous deposition scene. After losing his crown, Richard asks for a mirror and looks at his reflection. At first glance, this may seem like a simple dramatic gesture. However, the mirror carries deep symbolic meaning. The mirror represents Richard's royal identity. As long as he was king, he saw himself as God's chosen ruler and the center of political authority. But after being deposed, he begins to question who he really is. When Richard shatters the mirror, the action symbolizes the destruction of his public image and his sense of self. The king who once appeared powerful and sacred suddenly realizes how fragile political authority can be. This scene therefore represents an identity crisis. It also reveals the fragility of kingship itself. The key insight is this: a king's image can shatter as easily as glass. Shakespeare suggests that political power often depends upon perception, and once that perception collapses, authority can disappear rapidly. Now let us turn to body politic imagery. This idea was extremely important in medieval and Renaissance political thought. According to this concept, the state functions like a human body. Every part of society has a specific role, just as every organ contributes to the health of the body. The king is considered the head of this political body because he provides direction, leadership, and unity. When the king governs wisely, the body politic remains healthy and stable. But when authority becomes weak, corrupt, or divided, the entire state becomes diseased. Throughout Shakespeare's histories, civil wars, rebellions, and succession crises are often presented as symptoms of political illness. This imagery helps justify two important values: obedience and stability. The underlying message is that social harmony depends upon a healthy relationship between ruler and subjects. Finally, let us examine Shakespeare's use of silence. Silence is one of the most neglected dramatic techniques in Shakespearean criticism, yet it is often highly meaningful. In many history plays, silence can signify powerlessness, emotional tension, defeat, or loss of status. A striking example occurs when deposed kings gradually lose their ability to command attention. As their political authority disappears, their voices become less effective and sometimes fall silent altogether. Shakespeare uses these moments to show that speech and power are closely connected. A ruler's words matter because people obey them. Once authority is lost, even powerful speeches may have little effect. This leads to an important critical insight: loss of speech often symbolizes loss of authority. Therefore, through mirrors, body imagery, and strategic silence, Shakespeare explores the psychological and political dimensions of kingship in remarkably sophisticated ways. Now let us explore three sophisticated dramatic techniques that Shakespeare frequently uses in his history plays: offstage action, crowd psychology, and costume symbolism. First, let us consider offstage action. Many of the great battles and major political events in Shakespearean histories are not shown directly on stage. Instead, they are reported through messengers, soldiers, or eyewitness accounts. Partly, this was because the Elizabethan stage had practical limitations. It could not easily present huge armies, large-scale battles, or complex military scenes. However, Shakespeare turns this limitation into an artistic advantage. By reporting events rather than showing them directly, he shifts the audience's attention from action itself to its interpretation. The important question becomes not simply what happened, but how people understand, explain, and react to what happened. This technique emphasizes politics, perception, and narrative rather than spectacle alone. Next, let us examine crowd psychology. Shakespeare often presents the masses as highly influenceable and politically unstable. Public opinion can change quickly depending on speeches, rumors, propaganda, or changing political circumstances. A crowd that supports one ruler today may support another tomorrow. Throughout the history plays, leaders constantly try to shape public opinion because they understand that political authority depends partly upon popular perception. This leads to an important insight: power often depends on controlling the public narrative. Those who control how events are interpreted frequently gain political advantage. Finally, let us consider costume and disguise. In Shakespearean histories, clothing often symbolizes identity, status, and authority. Costumes are not merely decorative, they communicate political meaning. A particularly important example is Prince Hal. Throughout the Henry IV plays, he moves between different social worlds. He appears in taverns among common people and later presents himself as a royal leader. As his appearance changes, public perception of him also changes. This suggests a powerful idea. Kingship is, in part, a role that must be performed. Just as an actor wears a costume on stage, a king must wear the visible signs of authority and behave in ways that convince people of his legitimacy. Therefore, Shakespeare uses costume, public image, and performance to show that political power depends not only on who a ruler is, but also on how that ruler is perceived by others. Together, these techniques reveal Shakespeare's deep understanding of politics as a world shaped by interpretation, public opinion, and performance. Now let us examine 4 advanced ideas that help us understand how power operates in Shakespearean histories: religion as politics, justice versus power, the importance of names and titles, and the idea of history as memory rather than fact. First, let us look at religion as politics. In Shakespeare's history plays, religion is not simply a matter of personal faith. It is closely connected to political authority. Religious institutions can either support kings or challenge them. A ruler who receives religious approval appears more legitimate, while a ruler who loses that support may face political difficulties. A good example is King John, where conflicts between the king and the church become central to the political drama. Shakespeare shows that religion often functions as a tool of political legitimacy. Religious approval strengthens authority, while religious opposition can weaken it. Next, let us consider justice versus power. At first, we might assume that justice is objective and absolute. However, Shakespeare frequently presents a more complicated reality. In many of the history plays, ideas of justice are shaped by those who hold power. Victorious rulers often define what is legal, lawful, or acceptable. As political circumstances change, judgments also change. This leads to an important insight. What is considered just is often influenced by the ruler who possesses authority. Shakespeare therefore encourages audiences to question the relationship between morality and political power. Now let us examine the power of names and titles. In Shakespeare's political world, names are more than labels. They carry authority, legitimacy, and social identity. A powerful example appears in Richard II. The distinction between King Richard and Bolingbroke is not merely personal, it reflects an entire political hierarchy. When a ruler loses a title, he often loses part of his identity as well. This is why the deposition of kings is so psychologically painful. The loss of a crown is also the loss of status, recognition, and public selfhood. Finally, let us consider the idea that history is memory rather than fact. Shakespeare based many of his plays on sources such as Holinshed's Chronicles. However, he did not simply copy historical events. Instead, he selected, rearranged, emphasized, and sometimes altered details to create dramatic and political meaning. As a result, Shakespeare's histories are not neutral records of the past. They are interpretations of the past. This leads to a very important critical insight. History is selective remembering. Every historical narrative chooses what to highlight and what to omit. Shakespeare transforms historical facts into cultural memory, shaping how audiences understand kingship, power, legitimacy, and national identity. Therefore, these plays teach us that history is not only about what happened, it is also about how societies choose to remember and interpret what happened. Now let us quickly review the most important characters in Shakespearean histories. Richard II is a poetic and philosophical king, but his political weakness causes his downfall. Henry IV is a capable ruler, yet he remains haunted by guilt because he gained the throne through usurpation. Prince Hal, who becomes Henry V, represents Shakespeare's ideal ruler, combining wisdom, leadership, and political skill. Falstaff provides comic relief, but also represents realism, questioning honor and heroism. Hotspur is a brave warrior driven by honor, though his rigid ideals lead to his defeat. Finally, Richard III is Shakespeare's most famous villain, ambitious, manipulative, and ruthlessly determined to gain power. Together, these characters represent different models of leadership, ambition, honor, and kingship. Now we come to some of the most advanced topics in Shakespearean studies. These ideas are rarely discussed in basic courses, but they can make your answers stand out in examinations and higher-level literary discussions. First, let us examine textual variants. Many Shakespearean history plays exist in more than one version. The two most important forms are the quarto editions and the first folio edition. The quarto versions were generally published earlier and are often shorter. The first folio, published in 1623 after Shakespeare's death, collected many of his plays into a single volume and sometimes contains significant differences from earlier texts. Why is this important? Because it shows that Shakespeare's texts are not completely fixed or unchanging. Different versions may contain different lines, scenes, speeches, or stage directions. This opens important scholarly discussions about editing, authorship, revision, and textual authenticity. For literary critics, the question is not simply what Shakespeare wrote, but which version of Shakespeare we are reading. This is a rare but impressive point that can strengthen advanced examination answers. Next, let us consider collaboration. Many people assume that every Shakespeare play was written entirely by Shakespeare himself. However, modern scholarship suggests that some plays were collaborative efforts. For example, Henry VIII is widely believed to have been co-written with John Fletcher. This challenges the idea of Shakespeare as a completely solitary genius. An important insight is that even the idea of Shakespeare can sometimes be understood as a collaborative literary construct shaped by actors, editors, publishers, and fellow playwrights. Now let us examine the performance conditions of the Globe Theatre. These plays were originally performed in the famous Globe Theatre. The Globe had very few stage sets compared with modern theatres. As a result, Shakespeare relied heavily on language to create settings, battles, and dramatic atmosphere. Another important fact is that all female roles were performed by male actors because women were not allowed on the professional stage. The plays were also performed in daylight rather than under modern theatrical lighting. This increased the importance of speeches, rhetoric, and direct audience engagement. These conditions strongly influenced how the history plays were written and performed. Finally, let us consider audience diversity. The audience at the Globe Theatre included people from many social classes. Wealthy nobles, educated gentlemen, merchants, craftsmen, and ordinary workers all watched the same performances. Because of this mixed audience, Shakespeare wrote on multiple levels simultaneously. A noble might appreciate the political debates. A common spectator might enjoy the humor and action. A scholar might focus on philosophical and historical ideas. This is why Shakespeare's history plays successfully combine politics, comedy, psychology, philosophy, and entertainment within a single work. Understanding textual variants, collaboration, performance conditions, and audience diversity helps us see Shakespeare not only as a writer of plays, but also as a participant in a complex theatrical and cultural system. Now we come to some of the most sophisticated conclusions that Shakespearean histories offer about politics, power, and historical change. First, let us examine the distinction between legitimacy and effectiveness. Shakespeare repeatedly asks an important political question: is it better to be a legitimate ruler or an effective ruler? A perfect example is the contrast between Richard II and Henry IV. Richard II possesses legitimacy because he is the lawful king. His claim to the throne is unquestioned. However, he proves politically ineffective. He makes poor decisions, alienates important nobles, and fails to maintain support. Henry IV presents the opposite situation. His claim to the throne is questionable because he gains power by overthrowing Richard. In that sense, he is politically illegitimate. Yet he is far more effective as a ruler. He understands practical governance, strategy, and political survival. This leads to a profound insight. Shakespeare questions whether legitimacy alone is enough to govern successfully. The plays encourage audiences to think about the complex relationship between lawful authority and political effectiveness. Next, let us look at symbolic objects. In Shakespearean histories, objects often carry political meaning. The crown is not simply a piece of royal jewelry. It symbolizes responsibility, authority, and sometimes even burden. Characters frequently discover that wearing the crown brings anxiety rather than happiness. The throne represents political stability, but also political insecurity because many characters fight to possess it. The sword symbolizes violence, military power, conquest, and political force. These objects become symbols through which Shakespeare explores the nature of power. Now let us consider Shakespearean endings. Many readers assume that history plays end with the restoration of order. However, Shakespeare rarely presents perfect endings. Even when peace appears to return, future conflicts are usually implied. A good example is Henry V. Henry achieves remarkable success and unites England. Yet audiences already know that after his death, the nation will enter the chaos of the Henry VI period. Thus, political stability often proves temporary. This creates an important critical insight. Closure in Shakespearean histories is frequently an illusion. Every solution contains the possibility of future problems. Finally, let us discuss examination strategy. One of the best ways to write high-scoring answers on Shakespearean histories is to include 4 key elements. First, discuss one major theme, such as kingship, legitimacy, honor, or national identity. Second, refer to one important character. Third, mention one significant scene. Fourth, include one critic, theoretical concept, or advanced insight. For example, if writing about Richard II, you might discuss the theme of kingship, the character of Richard, the deposition scene, and the concept of the king's 2 bodies. This structure demonstrates textual knowledge, critical awareness, and analytical depth. Therefore, Shakespearean histories are not merely stories about kings. They are complex explorations of legitimacy, leadership, political performance, historical memory, and the continuous struggle for power. Before we conclude, let us look at 3 important critical approaches. First, New Historicism argues that history is not a fixed truth but a constructed narrative. Shakespeare does not simply record events. He reshapes history to create political and dramatic meaning. Second, the Marxist approach views the plays as struggles for power. Behind conflicts between kings and nobles lies a larger struggle over authority, control, and social hierarchy. Third, political criticism sees these plays as reflections of Elizabethan concerns. Issues such as succession, rebellion, legitimacy, and national stability mirror the anxieties of Shakespeare's own age. Together, these approaches show that Shakespearean histories are not just about the past, they are powerful commentaries on politics, power, and society. Conclusion: Shakespeare's history plays are not just about the past, they are about power in action. They reveal that kings are not born great, they must act, perform, and manipulate reality to survive.